Have you ever felt the frustration of getting a perfect moment lost in a very mediocre photo? Maybe your photos are looking very grainy, maybe the lighting's all off, it's looking dark or underexposed, or maybe it just altogether looks terrible and you're wondering why it looks so bad when you have such an expensive camera that can even handle up to 4K. Well, today we're going to talk about the intricacies of mirrorless cameras and talk about specifically how to use a camera correctly to get the sharpest photos and videos in the specific scenario that you're in. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here or don't know who I am, my name is Jorva and I'm a creator that lives and works here in London, UK. So jumping straight into it, to get amazing photos, you really have to understand the intricacies of mirrorless cameras. There's 4 specific things which I'll mention in just a bit. But overall, you need to understand how to use the settings correctly and adjust them for the situation that you're in. For example, specific settings in one scenario may not be perfect for the next scenario. So that's why you have to know how to use a camera to adjust the settings accordingly. The 4 things that we're going to talk about in this video are pretty much the most important things. And if you can understand these, then you're pretty much 90% of the way there to being a professional photographer. These 4 things are ISO, shutter speed, focal length, and frame rate. I'm going to go through each one now, talk about what exactly it is, how to use it, and give you some tips, that distinguish you from a beginner to someone who is more experienced in using a camera. So let's jump straight into the first one, and arguably the one which is talked about a lot, and that is the ISO. So ISO is talked about a lot, whether it be in camera forums or just amongst photographers and videographers, and is pretty common compared to the other settings that I'm going to mention later on in the video. But you can think of ISO as basically the brightness of your photo. Now there are caveats to this as well. If you push it too high, you will get a grainy image, so that's why people say to try to keep your ISO as low as possible. But overall, ISO just adjusts the brightness of your image. For example, if you're in an outdoor situation, maybe you're taking some sort of graduation photos, or maybe you're taking sports photography, you will most likely be keeping the ISO very low. Whereas if you're in a darker situation where there's not much light, for example, if you're an events videographer or photographer, you may have to push that ISO a lot further. When I recently got hired for a videography shoot at an event, I had to push that ISO a lot further than if I was obviously in a studio where I could control the lighting, or if I was outside taking photos or videos. You're probably wondering now, well, why do people say to keep your ISO as low as possible? Well, the main reason why people say to keep the ISO low is because the lower the ISO, the sharper the image. But as with all of these settings, one can't work without the other, and all 4 of the settings mentioned in this video will have to be used in conjunction with one another. If you really want to step it up though and level up from beginner to pro, I'll definitely say embrace the grain. And what I mean by that is don't be afraid of higher ISOs. They're definitely helpful in specific situations, and fortunately now we have a lot of good AI features in a lot of these editing softwares where you can get rid of a lot of grain. So if you're a pro, don't be afraid of using that higher ISO, because like we'll talk about further on in the video, having the other settings dialed in gives you more range to push your ISO a little bit further to create perfect exposure. The second setting that I want to talk about now is shutter speed, and the easiest way to showcase this is if I move my hand like this. So doing that, you may have noticed that there's not a lot of motion blur. There's just enough to make it look realistic, but it's not very choppy where it looks just completely fake, the movement, and everything is in focus like that. You can see that there is some sort of motion blur like that, creating a realistic effect of my hand moving. Now this may seem confusing at first. If I was to push my shutter speed a bit further, you would notice that your hand, there is no motion blur in your hand when you're moving it or in any object. And this is quite good if you're a sports photographer. You can put your shutter speed a bit higher to capture the action in detail and create a sharp image. But in video scenarios, you don't really want to push your shutter speed too high, because you will end up just having weird looking fake footage. Now, through a lot of trial and error in the camera industry, the main rule that people have come up with, and I would definitely agree with as well, is to keep your shutter speed double of your frame rate. So if I'm now shooting in 24 frames per second, which I am now, I would at a minimum want to keep it at 50, allowing my hand to look pretty perfect in terms of motion. The third setting now is the focal length. And you may have seen when buying lenses for your camera that every lens has an f value. So for example, one lens might have an f1.8 or one lens might have an f4. So what that f means is the amount of light that your sensor of your lens is letting through. The simplest way to think of it is the more light that your camera is letting through and the lower your f value, what will happen is your background will get a lot blurrier. So right now I'm shooting at f2.8. If I was to bring that up to f4 or something, you would see that my background will get a lot less blurrier. So this is where what I said earlier about knowing to use all the settings comes into play. Because what happens is the lower your f value, the more bright that your image gets. So in order to compensate how bright that image is, you either have to adjust the shutter speed or adjust the ISO. Now remember, shutter speed is about your motion blur, so you don't really want to have a weird motion picture or video. So I'd say I would recommend to keep the motion at the double the frame rate. Similarly, if your f-stop goes higher, your image gets darker, so you may have to add more ISO. But like I said earlier, it's just about juggling all of the settings and using them with one another to suit the environment that you're in. Now with a lot of beginners, I see them use the f-stop value as low as possible and create like a really blurry image and think that it looks professional. You know, 8 out of 10 times it does look professional, but sometimes it looks a bit too blurry and you want to see a bit of what is in your background as well. You don't really want it to be fully blurry. You may want to make out what is behind you and you just don't want it to be in focus as much as the subject. So I would recommend don't always just put it down to the lowest value. Play around with it and see if you can get different type of compositions and try to create images which have a lot of depth in them and a lot of detail. Lastly is the frame rate, and you may have heard this term a lot in sort of like the gaming community where they talk about 24 FPS or they talk about 120 FPS or 60 FPS on their games. It's essentially the same thing. Your frame rate is basically the number of frames which are recorded per second. So there's a couple options in your camera. There's 24, there's 30, there's 60, there's 120, and this all depends on the situation that you're in. So if you know that you're going to be recording a lot of slow-mo, which is very common for professional videography, then I always set my frame rate to 120 FPS. But for the average video like this where I'm sitting down and talking and everything is in real time, I'm always shooting at 24 FPS because it looks the most natural. So I'd say talking head, sitting down videos, average videos where you know you're vlogging or something, keep it 24 FPS. If you know that you're going to slow it down in post, you're creating some professional videos, then try to push that FPS as far as you can. But remember that some cameras only offer 120 at HD and other cameras offer 120 at 4K. So just know that your camera settings are different depending on what camera you have. So there you have it. That was a deep dive into those 4 settings, and what I think is most important and the biggest thing to take away from the video is that all 4 settings have to be used with one another. But nonetheless, I do hope you enjoyed the video, and I don't ask for subscribes early on in the videos, but if you did make it this far, then please consider subscribing down below and hit the like button and let me know in the comments if you're enjoying it. And that being said, I'll see you all in my next video.